All right, so, we're diving deep today, and you sent over some really interesting stuff about English idioms this time from the Real Life English podcast. And, well, if you've ever heard someone say something like, it's raining cats and dogs, and thought, what does that even mean? Then you're in the right place.
Yeah, exactly, because these phrases, they might sound a little strange at first.
Yeah.
They don't always make literal sense, but they're actually full of meaning. And like that image you just mentioned, raining cats and dogs.
Yeah.
Well, if you're picturing, actual animals falling from the sky, you're kind of missing the point.
Right.
It just means it's raining really hard, a heavy downpour. And that's the kind of puzzle we're going to be looking at today with idioms, trying to unlock the secrets behind these little linguistic shortcuts so you can understand why they exist and how they can make your communication, more colorful, more natural.
Okay, so we keep saying idioms, but what are they really? I mean, it's more than just using, colorful language, right? What makes a phrase an idiom?
Yeah, that's it. You hit the nail on the head. It's about the meaning, the overall meaning of the phrase being different from what the individual words literally mean. And that raining cats and dogs example is perfect.
Mm-hmm.
What rain is, what cats and dogs are, but put them together like that, and it just doesn't make sense literally.
Right.
Meaning is figurative. It's based on this shared understanding of what that specific phrase represents.
That makes sense. But then why even use them? Why not just say what you mean directly? Why go through all these, roundabout phrases?
That is a great question. And it gets to the core of why idioms are so important in language. They often reflect a culture's history, their values, their humor even. And they add this layer of expressiveness that you might not get with just literal language. And as the Real Life English podcast pointed out, using idioms, it can make you sound more fluent, more natural, especially if you're learning the language.
Yeah.
Because it shows you're going beyond just basic vocabulary and grammar. You're starting to grasp those subtle shades of meaning.
Almost like a secret code.
Exactly. A code that lets you say a lot with just a few words. But only if you know the code, of course.
Right, and that's where it can get tricky, especially if you're not familiar with these idioms, right?
Absolutely. The material you shared definitely highlighted that challenge because the meaning isn't always clear just from looking at the individual words. You can't just break it down and analyze it literally, which is why sometimes, it can lead to misunderstandings. And that's why it's so important to learn idioms in context.
Yeah.
By seeing how they're actually used in real conversations and stories and movies.
So it makes me wonder, where did these phrases come from in the first place? I mean, did someone just decide one day that heavy rain should be called raining cats and dogs? There's got to be some origin story, right?
In many cases, there is a really interesting one. And some of these idioms, as your source mentioned, go back centuries. They come from historical events, literature, old customs, all sorts of places. Like the example of bite the bullet. It was in the material you sent.
Yes. Bite the bullet. We hear that one a lot when someone has to face a difficult situation, but where does that saying even come from?
Well, the most common theory is that it comes from a long time ago, back in the early days of surgery, especially, on battlefields, when anesthesia wasn't really a thing.
Oh, wow.
And to help patients deal with the pain, which would be excruciating, they would literally be given a bullet to bite down on.
Oh my gosh.
So the idiom now, it means to endure something difficult or painful with courage and, kind of gritting your teeth and bearing it. And it's interesting, right, how that image has stayed with us, that connection to a real historical practice.
Wow. Yeah, that is a stark origin, but it definitely makes the meaning stick with you.
It does.
So, okay, let's jump into some of these common expressions that the Real Life English podcast highlighted in your materials. And I think a good place to start would be break a leg. Because if you heard that, right before going on stage, you might think someone was wishing you harm.
Literally, it sounds like a threat. But as the source material explains, it actually means to wish someone good luck, especially, in the context of a performance. And they gave a great example since you're going to do great in your performance tonight, break a leg.
Right.
And it's that contrast, that almost, ironic twist that makes idioms so interesting. And it makes you wonder, why that specific phrase for good luck. Maybe there's some kind of theatrical superstition behind it, a belief that saying the opposite would actually bring good fortune. Who knows?
That's a really interesting thought. Okay, so what about spill the beans? What image does that bring to mind? Maybe someone dropping their groceries.
It could be that, but in this case, spill the beans means to reveal a secret, and the example they gave was John accidentally spilled the beans about the surprise party. Now Sarah knows all about it.
It's like that secret was being held in a container, and someone just went and tipped it over. And it's fascinating, isn't it, how these everyday actions, spilling something, become these metaphors for more abstract ideas like sharing confidential information. Have you ever accidentally spilled the beans on something?
Oh, yeah, I think we all have. At some point, it's that feeling of, oops, it just slipped out.
Exactly.
Okay.
Well.
Okay, here's another one, hit the sack. And this one makes me think of like a rough day, just collapsing.
It does sound a bit rough, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
But thankfully, the meaning is much more peaceful. Hit the sack simply means to go to bed. And the example from the Real Life English podcast was, I'm really tired after that long day at work. Time to hit the sack.
Time to hit the sack, yeah.
And you can almost imagine, someone in the past maybe falling onto a simple mattress, filled with straw, a sack after a long day's work.
Right.
It's a very, kind of visceral image that connects to that meaning.
Yeah, and it helps you remember it. Okay, so then there's under the weather, which maybe feels a little more self-explanatory, but what's the nuance there?
Yeah, under the weather means feeling a bit sick or unwell, not feeling your best. And the example they gave was, I won't be coming to work today. I'm feeling a little under the weather. And it's interesting how it's a softer way of saying you're sick, right? It's not as direct. It's like the weather, has somehow affected you. And we use a lot of weather metaphors in language, don't we?
We do.
Maybe because the weather is such a constant presence in our lives and it can be so unpredictable, just like sometimes how we feel.
And I think it's a good time to revisit Bite the Bullet again.
Yes, definitely good to reinforce that one.
To really let that origin story sink in.
Exactly. So to bite the bullet is to face a difficult or unpleasant situation with courage. And, that stoicism that we talked about in the example was, I hate getting shots, but I had to bite the bullet and get vaccinated, which I think brings it into a very relatable modern context. And what do you think is so interesting about this idiom, going from that very specific historical scenario to how we use it today?
It really shows you how these phrases can survive and adapt through time. They capture these universal human experiences, like whether it's battlefield surgery or getting a vaccine, and they give us a way to communicate those feelings concisely.
Yeah.
So for you, the listener, these examples from the Real Life English podcast, they really highlight how idioms work. They rely on this shared understanding of figurative language, where the literal meaning is secondary to the implied message.
That's right. And that brings us to some practical advice, for anyone listening who wants to learn and start using idioms effectively. And the Real Life English podcast had some great tips.
Yeah, they did. And I think the first one was start with the common idioms. Don't try to learn the most obscure ones right off the bat. Stick to the expressions you're likely to hear in everyday conversation on TV and movies. And their example was piece of cake.
Yes, a classic.
You probably heard that one, right?
Definitely piece of cake, meaning something is very easy to do. And it's so common that you're bound to come across it all the time. And starting with these high-frequency idioms is a good strategy because you'll get more chances to hear them in context, which is crucial for really understanding how they're used.
And another helpful tip they gave was to learn idioms by category, which I thought was a smart approach.
It's a great way to organize your learning, grouping idioms together by theme, so whether it's the emotions, the weather, work situations, time, whatever it might be, can really help you remember them. And the Real Life English podcast give the examples of time-related idioms like better late than never and the early bird catches the worm. And seeing those connections, how different idioms relate to a central concept can make them much easier to remember and to use correctly.
Yeah.
Have you ever tried learning things by category?
I have, and it really does help make those connections in your mind.
It does.
Okay, and then they talked about using idioms in the right context, which I imagine can be a bit tricky sometimes.
It's very important. Some idioms are quite informal. And, you need to be mindful of your audience. In the situation, you wouldn't use very casual slang in a formal business presentation, for instance.
Right.
The Real Life English podcast cautioned against using, overly casual idioms in those kinds of settings, like business emails, unless they're very common and accepted in that specific professional culture. And their example was hit the nail on the head.
Oh, yeah, meaning to be exactly right.
Exactly. And it's fine to use in a casual conversation with a coworker. But it might sound a bit out of place in a serious client meeting.
That's a really good point. Knowing when not to use an idiom can be just as important as knowing what it means.
Absolutely.
And finally, they talked about practice, actually putting these idioms into practice.
Yes. The Real Life English podcast really emphasized that using idioms in your own sentences, whether you're speaking or writing, is the best way to truly learn them. And they even suggested trying to incorporate one new idiom every day, into your communication.
Oh, wow.
It's about moving beyond just recognizing them when you hear them and actually using them actively in your own speech. That's how you really start to own them.
Which brings us to a more interactive part, kind of like what the Real Life English podcast does sometimes.
Little quiz.
Yeah, a little quiz to put you, the listener, to the test. So we'll give you an idiom or remind you of its meaning and the example we shared earlier.
Okay, first up we have piece of cake, meaning something is very easy. And our example was, that test was a piece of cake. I finished it in just 10 minutes. So think about a time when you found something surprisingly easy. Could you use this idiom to describe it?
Next, we have cost an arm and a leg, which means something is very expensive. And the example was, this designer handbag costs an arm and a leg. I can't afford it. So have you seen anything recently that you thought cost an arm and a leg?
And last but not least, let the cat out of the bag, meaning to reveal a secret. And our example was, Tom let the cat out of the bag about the new office renovation. Now everyone knows. Has anyone ever let the cat out of the bag about a surprise for you? How did you react?
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's clear that idioms, they really add a lot to the English language. They bring this richness, this vibrancy. But as we've seen, mastering them, it takes time, it takes attention, it takes a willingness to embrace, the figurative side of language.
Exactly. And with consistent effort, and paying attention to context, you'll start understanding these colorful phrases more easily, and you'll feel more confident using them yourself.
Yeah, it's about fine-tuning your ear to the nuances.
Exactly.
And to echo the Real Life English podcast, we encourage you to try and use just one new idiom this week. In your conversations, you might be surprised how it adds a little extra something and how natural it can feel.
It's all about that ongoing exploration of language. There are always new layers to uncover, new ways to express ourselves, and understanding and using idioms. It's a step in that direction. It not only improves your communication, but it also gives you a glimpse into the culture and the history behind the language.
That's true.
And it makes you wonder what other hidden stories might be hiding within, those seemingly ordinary phrases we use every day.
That's something to think about.
It is.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure.
Until next time, happy exploring.
Keep learning.